Hello and welcome to the Knowing Self, Knowing Others podcast, where we discuss self-aware leadership with thinkers from around the globe. I'm your host, Nia Thomas. Join me as we talk to today's guest.
So today I'm thrilled to be joined by Richard Reid, who's an executive coach, psychotherapist and leadership expert. With a wealth of experience working with high-profile leaders, Richard is passionate about helping people unlock their potential through self-awareness and emotional intelligence. And of course, that's what we're all here for. As the founder of Pinnacle Wellbeing Services, he has guided countless professionals towards greater confidence, resilience, and authentic leadership. In this episode, we're going to explore the role of self-awareness in leadership, success, and uncover practical strategies to enhance it, which is exactly what we're all about. So, Richard, a very big welcome to the show.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me. Really good to be here.
So tell us about your journey into leadership coaching and how did self-awareness become central to your work?
Yeah. So it's a bit of a circuitous route, to be honest. I used to work as a business consultant in IT and hated it. In fact, the only bit of it I really enjoyed was being the interface between the techies and the normal users. And I took a year out to go traveling. When I was traveling, I ended up, as strange as it sounds, sharing a tent with a psychiatrist from Wales who was traveling because he just got divorced. And we were exchanging stories. He said, well, what are you doing here? I said, well, I took a bit of time out. I want to decide what I want to do with the rest of my life. He said, have you ever thought about being a psychotherapist? He told me a little bit about it. And when I got back from Argentina, I looked it up, started doing some courses, and it really sort of snowballed from there. It got to the point where actually I made that transition to being a therapist. And the area of London that I was working in is Mayfair, and there's lots of businesses around there. So a lot of the people that I was seeing were leaders, were owners of businesses, and they started seeing the value in what I was doing with them. And so, well, why don't you come and do some work with some of our people or run some training for us? So that's how I sort of evolved into being a coach as well. And what I've found over the years is that a lot of those sort of psychological principles that I use within the therapy world are readily transferable to any kind of walk of life. You might use a slightly different spin on it or different language, but essentially it's working with the same sorts of skills. And for me, going back to the point you made around self-awareness, I think any kind of change needs to start with self-awareness, because actually if you don't have the capacity to register what's going on internally for you and what's going on for the people around you, you're not going to know how to use those skills in a skillful way.
Most definitely. And I can't agree more. When you say high profile leaders, who or what sort of roles, who exactly do you mean?
So a variety of people. So it's a really interesting part of London where I sort of cut my teeth. So you've got high profile CEOs, you've got entrepreneurs. I've even dealt with a few people from very famous families that most people will know, including some royalty as well, European royalty. So it's varied enormously, lots of different walks of life. But again, I found that those sort of core skills have served me really well in any kind of environment, really.
So if people want to meet the rich and famous, you definitely need to go to Mayfair. When you talk about self-awareness, what does it mean for you? How do you define it?
Well, I think first and foremost, in fact, everything that I do starts with registering what's going on inside of you. If you don't know what's going on inside of you, you don't know what you're giving out, and you have very little ability to actively control and influence that. And a lot of people, one of the things that I do is I deal with charisma, and we'll no doubt come on to that a little bit later, I'm sure. But a lot of people think that's all about external skills. That's actually the latter part of it. The first part is having the spare capacity to register what's happening for you and to think about what other people need from you. And a lot of the time we don't, because we're not aware of what's happening for us. We don't have the ability to know when to apply skills. If we have the skills, then what that means is that we're often operating in autopilot. We're driven by our instincts and our impulses, and sometimes that works in our favor and sometimes it backfires. So being self-aware, it gives you that little bit of distance from what might be going on for you, what the prevailing emotions, thoughts might be, to make considered choices. And this is really, really important for all kinds of things. What works in one situation won't necessarily work with something else, because people are different, situations are different. So you've got to have that little bit of nuance and agility, really.
You mentioned the term spare capacity, and I think I know what you mean. but tell me what you mean, just in case I've heard it wrong or I've interpreted it wrong.
Sure. So for me, I always use the analogy of the bucket. You imagine all the things that are going on for you, all the influences that have a bearing on you. They start to fill your bucket. And if your bucket's full or overspilling, then you are no longer in control. You can't make informed choices about what you need to do. And you're going to be so absorbed by your own thoughts and emotions that you're going to have very little consideration or ability to think about what other people might need from you in that environment. So creating space internally, so to speak, gives you that flexibility to think about how do I want to be and what do other people need from me right now. So it really sort of helps in terms of building connections with people as much as anything else. It's connecting with people rather than objectifying them.
If we think about those people who are in those really senior roles, they are dealing with crisis situation or they're dealing with stress on possibly a daily basis. How do they give themselves that space, that thinking space, that space to respond rather than react?
Yeah, it's tricky because when you've got lots going on, inevitably you're going to be more fired up. You're going to have less opportunity to think about what's going on for you and what other people need. So you've got to create that space. And ideally, what I say to people is, if you can, just have a little bit of time at the start of your day to set your intention for the day, to think about what you've got coming up and how you're going to manage that. And I realize that's not always practical for people. And people will say, well, look, I can't take time out. That feels like a pressure in itself. I've got even less time then to do the things that I need to do. So one of the areas that I often look at with people is transitions. And by transitions, what I mean is what do you do when you're going from one task or situation to another? And I think this is even more important now than ever before, because a lot of what we're doing is online, it's virtual. Whereas before, you think about how traditionally we might be, you go from one meeting room to another, you go from one office to another. So you've got those natural breaks to reflect, to recharge, to do whatever you need to do to get yourself in a good position for the next meeting. We don't have that luxury now. We're often going from one meeting to another, to another, to another. And that has an impact on the brain. And it also means that we become more naturally transactional. So these transitions for me are really, really important. Even if you've only got 30 seconds, just to take a breath, register whatever the prevailing emotions are. So even if you haven't got time to completely manage that, to be aware of it so you can at least mitigate against that. So if you're quite fired up from the last meeting, if you're aware of that, it might be that you decide to go a little bit slower. You engage in that conversation with a larger degree of caution rather than diving right in using those sort of prevailing emotions. So even just slowing down is useful, or setting the intention. What is the emotion, the atmosphere that I want to create in this next meeting? And often we don't do that. We think about objectives in terms of what we want to say, what we want to get out of it. We don't think about how we're going to do that. And that's the bit that for me is often missing. It's the bit where we connect with somebody.
Yeah, definitely. And you're right. No longer are we worrying about the 2 flights of stairs to make sure we get to the next meeting. It's 2 clicks and you're there.
Yeah.
And there is very little thinking time in between, and you have to
Absolutely.
switch. That switching really does take a lot of energy for you to put something down to pick something else up. Yeah. And your emotions have to be stop-start in the same way.
Absolutely. And for me, the other thing is that we're often slaves to our diaries. And, I realize that, nobody exists in a bubble and there's certain things that have to happen at certain times. But actually, the more self-aware we become, the more we can register the types of interactions that tire us out, the kind of interactions that energize us. And we can start to be a little bit more dynamic with how we manage our diaries. And I think even that helps in terms of how we then come across and how efficient we are as well.
Yeah, that's true. So it's about thinking what happens in the morning, where does your energy live in the day, and are you attaching the right energy to the right conversations, and are you even giving yourself time to think about it?
Absolutely. And for some people, I guess particularly introverts, it can be quite tiring interacting with people. So you have to interact with people, but how you manage that can be important. So if there are very important interactions, it might be you space them out more, or you spread them across a week. So you're not condensing them all. And in other words, working against yourself.
Absolutely.
Playing to your strength as much as possible.
As a card-carrying introvert, I'm going to replay that and rethink about that. It's good to reflect. Absolutely. You mentioned charisma. So tell us more about charisma. You run charisma masterclasses. Tell us more about the kind of things that people will explore, and how are you in helping people to improve reputation, branding, social capital? And those are all of the things that I tend to think about when I'm talking about charisma. But again, maybe you have a different definition.
No, it's very much along the lines of what you've just said. So I think, a lot of people think charisma is about charm. It's about sort of telling people what they want to hear. It's not that at all. And again, it starts with where we really enter this conversation. It starts with managing your internal world before you think about how you influence your external world. If you're not in command of that, you've got less opportunity to really make an impact with other people. So it starts with that self-awareness piece. And then it's about being more deliberate and purposeful in how you come across. Because a lot of time we do things without questioning them. We do them in autopilot. And the most charismatic people tend to be very deliberate and purposeful. And people extrapolate that. They see that and they then associate that with your ability to achieve their goals, to succeed on projects, all these kinds of things. So self-awareness helps you to be more deliberate and purposeful. But it also, again, going back to this other point that we made before, it helps you to be more aware of what's going on for other people so you can pivot in real time. If your message is not meeting somebody's needs, you are more likely to pick up on that by looking at the emotions that sit beneath their words, or subtle shifts in their body language that tell you, actually, I need to take a different tack, or I need to check in with somebody to see if that's landed properly. So it's creating something with somebody rather than talking at people. And I think for most of us, we're not very good at that. We like to go into situations almost having a script in our head of what we're going to say. And when people are talking, we're already thinking what we're going to say next. This is about trusting the process. And as a therapist, it's something that we learn very early on in the training. But again, people don't like it. They like to know how it's going to play out. And when you do that, you make assumptions. You miss things that might be quite significant in real time, and you objectify people. People react well to being seen and heard for who they are and being validated for it. And that's how we make those stronger, longer term connections. But also that self-awareness helps us to be more consistent. So it's branding. You don't go to the shop and buy a different box of cornflakes every time. You hope you go to the shop, so the cornflakes are pretty much the same every time you get them. So it's the same with our brand. The more aware we are, yes, we might deviate to meet the particular needs of the situation, but by and large, people know what they're going to get, and that's reassuring for people, and it also helps them to be able to promote us with others.
So if you could give me 2 top tips of how I could really build and become more charismatic in my communication, what 2 things can I do?
Well, I think the first thing is taking more pauses. So a lot of the time we think about charisma as being about, entertaining, performing, talking. And absolutely that's part of it. If you don't say anything, then clearly that's not going to be charismatic. But sometimes slowing down and creating space is equally important. And it's particularly important when you're dealing with introverts, because introverts often take more time to think about what they want to say and how they want to say it. And a lot of the time, because they internalize things, what they say is not necessarily the definitive version of what they think. So creating that extra space allows people to hear their own words, to reflect, to qualify, and actually to get an experience from that they don't get with many other people. So I think for me, slowing down, creating pauses is really important. And it's also important in terms of gravitas. Gravitas is an important aspect of charisma. So in other words, when we say something, it has weight. We're not just saying things to fill the space. You think about some of the most significant leaders, what they say carries a lot of weight, but equally they're comfortable enough in their own skin to know that they don't have to justify their existence by speaking at every opportunity. And they create space for other people to come into the conversation. So that would be my first tip. My second tip would really be thinking about intention. Again, going back to what we mentioned before with Zoom calls and Teams calls. So intention is massively important. I may know the significance of what it is that I'm saying, why it's a fantastic idea or whatever else it might be. But actually, the way that ideas capture people's attention is when you activate their emotions. So thinking about what is the emotion I want to create in my message is really, really important. Do I want people to feel reassured? Do I want people to feel inspired and excited? All of these things then start to play into how we use our words, how we use our voice, how we use our body language. So in other words, we're adapting to suit the situation rather than doing the things that we do instinctively, which may or may not accentuate our message. They may actually dilute the message. So setting your intention is really, really important.
I think that's really interesting. And as you're talking, I'm thinking I will often go into a situation and I'll be thinking about what I'm going to say, but I very rarely think about how I want people to feel. I know what I want people to know at the end of it, but do I ever stop and think I want people to be excited or reassured or feel a sense of trust in the process? I probably don't articulate it to myself or to anybody else.
Yeah, and most of us don't. Again, particularly when we're operating at speed and we're going from one interaction to another, we don't think about it. But certainly the content of what you say is really, really important. But I think we often get quite lazy and think that's enough. So this is sort of the more advanced part of what we would teach in the Charisma Masterclass is the body language, the voice, the sentence structure, where you put the emphasis. So that it's almost sort of saying to people, this is the bit you need to listen to. This is how you need to feel when you hear what I'm saying.
I'm really interested in the connection between self-awareness and the choices that we make about behavior. So really, at the very beginning, you talked about our self-reflection, and then we have an impact on others, which then allows us to make choices about how we behave. And that really does fit with my 3-layer definition of self-awareness. When it comes to branding, reputation, how do we really manage those choices? How do we think about our connections between ourselves and the choices we are making and the behavior that then comes next?
Interesting question. I think a lot of the time we don't, because we're so busy. And I think what I often encourage people to do is think about who are you when you're at your best, and to use that as a basis. And sometimes people really struggle with that concept, or they've got a vague notion, but it doesn't come into their everyday conscious thought. So setting that as a underpinning for everything is really, really important. And one of the things that I also encourage people to do, and a lot of people sort of balk at the idea, is ask other people. Ask people for constructive feedback. Who are you when you're at your best? What are your vulnerabilities that come out maybe when you're under pressure? And the more that we're aware of that, again, it gives us a really strong basis to think about the areas we need to work on, but also the areas that we need to double down on. And I think for most of us, we're really good at pointing out our vulnerabilities and our weaknesses. We tend to take what we're good at for granted. And if we recognize that and we get that feedback from other people, then we're more likely to appreciate it, we're more likely to safeguard it, we're more likely to nurture it.
Yeah,
so for me, self-reflection and feedback are really, really important. And that's an ongoing process, because with anything, but, particularly something like charisma, it's always a work in motion. We've always got, the positives and the negatives. And if you get too complacent with it, you slip back into old unwanted behavior. So that ongoing feedback is really, really important. And that then allows you to think about, where am I? What do I want to build on? But also, where are the gaps? If this is who I aspire to be, how am I going to bridge that gap? And is that gap realistic? Am I trying to be somebody that I'm not? And it's quite interesting that actually one of the things that makes people most charismatic is their uniqueness. It's not about a one size fits all. And often we think it's about being the loudest person in the room, the most entertaining person. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. Some of this is about celebrating your uniqueness and getting comfortable with that. And the more comfortable you get with it, the more you bring that into your everyday experience, the more hopefully you get the validation that that's okay. Or even better, that that's fantastic. So you can be quirky, and that can be charismatic. But for most of us, we hide in the crowd. We only show people the parts of ourselves that we think are socially acceptable. We all have to adapt. But there are so many parts of ourselves that we hide away. I can't possibly tell people that, or I can't show people that side of me. But when we do that, we grow. We come into the light, and we become more memorable.
I'm so glad you used the word quirky. I will always remember the job that I did the longest. When I left that role, 2 people, totally unrelated, referred to me as quirky. And I was quite shocked at the time. But since then, I've thought, do you know what? I'm going to lean into my quirkiness, and I'm okay with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Would you rather that than be vanilla?
Oh, definitely. Quirky all day. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've written a white paper called Embracing Dislike. And I was when I read that, I was really interested. When I did my master's, I focused on likability and leadership. So
Mm.
tell us more about this idea about how you can, I guess, cope with and capitalize on being disliked.
Yeah, I mean, it's not something that comes naturally to most people. You know, we're social animals. We want to fit in. We want to be liked. And certainly the research shows that agreeability goes a long way in life. But it also runs the risk of meaning that you blend into the background and your boundaries get crossed on a frequent basis. So you get compromised. And what's important to you gets compromised. So it's really striking that balance that, yes, we want to get on with people. We want to create win-win situations. But sometimes charisma is about saying, well, this is who I am. This is who I am, and this is what I believe in. And even that, you know, yes, if we can get people to like us when we do that, fantastic. But it makes you memorable. You know, going back to that idea of branding, people know what you stand for. And there are certainly, you know, lots of public figures. We don't necessarily like them, but we respect them and we remember them. So it's striking that balance. And a lot of the time we compromise ourselves too much because we want to hide in the crowd. So it's having the courage to come out of that. And it's probably unrealistic to say that people are going to make that transition overnight, but it's doing it through small, incremental, repeated steps that desensitize yourself to the discomfort of that you actually learn from it. In a lot of cases, you think actually that there's a value to this. There's a value to me engaging in these alternative behaviors. But the only way you know that is to test those boundaries with small, incremental steps.
Yeah, it definitely takes courage to
Mm.
put yourself in a position where it's likely that some people are going to disagree with you or they're not going to like your decision. And
Yeah.
that's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. But you know, courage is important. People gravitate towards people who are courageous.
That's true. A few weeks ago, I spoke to John Christie, and he's a retired firefighter paramedic who talks about stress, burnout, and
Mm.
PTSD. When he was talking about his situation, he talked about reflecting on it and how that reflection helped him grow and heal. Now, you
Mm.
deliver critical incident stress debriefing. What does that mean? And what is different about that than any other kind of debriefing we might have led as a manager or a leader?
Yeah, so for major incidents, so maybe there's been a natural disaster or a fire or a death or a robbery. It's those kind of things. And what you would generally do is get a team of people together who have been either directly or indirectly involved in that and get them to share various aspects of that experience. And the idea behind doing that is that if you do that within the first sort of 24 to 72 hours after a major event, it reduces the likelihood of people getting PTSD.
Okay.
And there are a number of reasons for that. So part of that process is about providing people with psychoeducation, normalizing some of the symptoms, getting people to share any of those symptoms they might have, and giving them sort of a roadmap if it is the case that they start to encounter any of those things. And in my experience, when people don't know where their symptoms are coming from, they often panic, and it adds an extra layer of anxiety to it. And in some cases, they kind of try and bury their head in the sand. Whereas if they know it's part of a normal process, they are more likely to come forward because it feels a little bit more normal. But the other reason for bringing everybody together in that context is because it allows people to fill in the gaps. People often struggle when they don't have a full understanding of what's going on. Maybe they were on the periphery of it, maybe they only saw an aspect of it. So it fills in some of those gaps, and it also creates a support network because everybody feels that they're connected. So that's the principle behind it, and it largely works well. I mean, there are a few caveats to that, and I think it's important to stress those. So I think one is that some people don't like group activities. So, you know, again, going back to introverts, a lot of introverts don't like to talk about what's going on. From a lot of people in general don't. And some of it will depend upon the strength of your relationships with your work colleagues to begin with. So it's not a be all and end all. I think it's an important step, but it's not necessarily a be all and end all. And equally, some people will be struggling and won't feel comfortable to acknowledge that. So it's also a way of actually observing how people interact in those situations to maybe think about who looks like they're struggling, who looks like they're reticent. And so rather than that process being the end point, it can often be the entry point for people getting more focused individual attention. So it has to be used with a degree of nuance. It's not a case of deliver it in a rote fashion where you work through the various steps and you say, right, okay, you're all fine now. There will always be a few people that slip through, but it certainly helps to address a lot of the concerns that the majority of people will have. And a lot of people don't know anything about the symptoms of trauma. So even just explaining this is natural, this is like to pass within a few days, helps to people to feel a little bit more relaxed, not feel like what they experience is perhaps the tip of the iceberg.
I'm reminded that we are 5 years on from the end of COVID, and often my colleagues and I will stop and say, do you remember that time? And I can't remember a point where we stopped and reflected purposefully and purposely on COVID and what happened, what did we do, what was the situation, what didn't we do? What are your thoughts on how we are reflecting on that situation in terms of future PTSD or future situations and our ability to deal with crisis kind of situations?
Mm-hmm. I think I would agree with what you're saying. I think there hasn't been that reflection. I think that as a society, there was just a lot of relief to be operating in a inverted commas a normal way again. So a lot of people threw themselves back into that. A lot of organisations immediately assumed that people would be okay to resume what they were doing before. And it's true to say that that there's increased instances of anxiety and PTSD. A lot of people died. A lot of people were very, very ill during that process. A lot of people lost out on a lengthy period of normal socialization, landmark life events, graduation from school, exams, all those kinds of things that most of us have taken for granted. So there are delayed impacts to that, and close relatives and loved ones died, and a lot of time people didn't really connect with that experience. They knew that it happened, but because they weren't around it, it hasn't fully sunk in for them, even after all this time. So inevitably, that there is going to be delayed reaction to a lot of these things. I've worked quite a lot in sort of emergency services, particularly the police, and you often see, even years after the event, suddenly something will come up for somebody that they thought wasn't an issue, because life's moved on, but their emotions didn't. So I think it's inevitable that we're going to have more of this stuff coming out in the years to come.
Yeah, I think you're right. You also deliver training on storytelling, which I think is quite closely aligned with our personal branding, our awareness of self. What are a few things that you can share to help us as leaders become better storytellers?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is intention. What is it that you want people to feel? And that might vary at different points in the story. But if all you're doing is relaying facts, that's not going to capture people's imagination. So I think setting your intention is really important, and thinking about how you're then going to use the senses to bring that alive. So you think about how most people operate. Something like 70% of the population, their preferred modality is visual. Mm-hmm. So how can you use a variety of different scenarios that bring alive the senses, but particularly visual? How is it you can even use your body language and your voice to bring that energy alive at the relevant points? So all of those things are really, really important. And also the structure of the story is really important. One of the structures I particularly like is the hero's arc, where so this goes all the way back to the classical times, and it's really all about difficulty, challenge, and how we're going to overcome that, or how we have overcome that. So it's this idea, almost like a redemption story. It's the kind of classic thing that you see in a lot of films. And so there's a lot to be said for using some of those sort of scripts to form the structure of what we have to say. And again, going back to your point before about reflection, it's not just about inspiring people to think about what it is that we want them to do, but, in organizations, creating a culture and a legacy that also reflects back on things that you've been through. And that's how you create that shared history. So again, this is where something like the hero's arc can be really, really useful, because you talk about where people have come from, what the challenges were, and the character and the learning that came from that. And again, it promotes that sense of shared history, but also it promotes the idea of a growth mindset. When we get people to reflect on what they've learned from difficult experiences, they're not just grateful to have moved on from them, but they absorb the full nutrients from them.
I talk about experiential learning. So I've got a self-aware leadership compass, and one of the directions is experiential learning. And I'm thinking that I think from what you're saying is that we can share our experiences and our learning by being better storytellers and thinking about the structure of the story, but not only the content of it, but our intention in terms of how we want people to feel.
Absolutely. And you think about sort of early society. Early society, that their cultures and their customs were often built around shared stories, shared history. And those stories may or may not have been true, but they were the common currency, the common language that unified those people and made them feel that they were joined. And so there's a tremendous opportunity in not just talking about the challenges that might be coming up within an organisation, but again, this idea of reflecting back. What have we been through? What has it shown about us? And all the research shows that when we highlight the characteristics and the strengths that have emerged to deal with difficult situations, if we point people to those, then people gravitate towards them more. In the same way as if we give somebody a compliment and say, what I like about you is X, Y, and Z, they gravitate towards that behaviour more. So there's some really good opportunities that we can very easily miss out if we're not thinking about this idea of storytelling.
Before you go, tell us about your book.
So my book came out about 2 weeks ago, and it's called Charisma Unlocked. And it's primarily aimed at business professionals, but I guess there are things in there for anybody, really. And it's a book that you don't have to read from cover to cover. You can dip into different chapters, but it's essentially about many of the things that we've spoken about today. First and foremost, it's about how you manage your internal world. It then starts to go into things like how you use your voice, how you use your body language, how you can use conversational intelligence to understand the emotions that sit beneath the words that people say. And I think that is at the core of it, because sometimes people use words and they're not even aware of what they're feeling beneath all of that. So if we can decipher that for them, and better still, find elegant ways of bringing that to their attention, it builds that extra rapport with them. It creates greater opportunities for alignment in our dealings with people. So it's really a book that is about trying to create better opportunities for us and better opportunities for other people.
Wow, it sounds like, listeners and watchers, if you want to buy 2 books that create a pack of information to help you develop your self-aware leadership, if you get hold of the Self-Awareness Superhighway and Richard's book, you will have a real encyclopedia of how to do it. We will make sure that there is a link in the show notes to Richard's book and his website. So 3 things, 3 thoughts to help our listeners and watchers to develop their self-awareness before you go.
Okay, so number 1, create more space. So if you can't carve time out every day, think about those transitions between situations. Even if you've only got 30 seconds, what can you be doing in that time? Could you be adapting your breathing? Could you be thinking about your next intention? Create more space in your conversations. So how can you slow down? How can you create space for other people to qualify and fully express themselves? So that would be the second one. And then I think the third one, we haven't really touched on this today, is I think it's about having the courage of vulnerability. We spoke a little bit about sharing your quirkiness, your uniqueness. Vulnerability is part of that. And vulnerability can also be about acknowledging mistakes, acknowledging things that you don't understand. And when we do that, within reason, so long as we're showing competency in between times, it's a great way of actually giving other people permission to share what's going on for them on a deeper level, what they don't understand, what they struggle with, what they want to know. So it builds greater rapport, and actually it ultimately elevates us and elevates other people. So I think for me, those would be the top 3 things that I encourage people to take away from today.
Brilliant. Richard, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think there's lots of commonality between my thoughts on self-awareness and self-aware leadership and your ideas and your models. I have been to your website. You've got a wealth of information on there. You've got blogs, you've got training courses. So I definitely recommend listeners and watchers, you go and find out more about what Richard has available. We will make sure all of that interesting information and all those links are in the show notes. But for now, Richard, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we aim to develop self-aware leaders around the globe to generate kinder, more respectful and creative working relationships through reflection, recognition and regulation. Head over to my website at knowingselfknowingothers.co.uk to sign up to my newsletter to keep up to date with my blog, podcast and book. Looking forward to having you on my learning journey.